Living on a fixed income changes the way a shortage feels. It isn't just an annoyance when a shelf goes bare, it's a real decision between spending money you don't have or doing without. For older adults, several items on this list aren't luxuries. They're the line between riding out a rough stretch calmly and struggling through one. One entry has caught households off guard more than almost any other, and it's rarely what people expect. Keep reading, the number one pick may genuinely surprise you. Grocery shopping doesn't feel the way it used to. Even shoppers who've managed a household budget for decades say the numbers no longer add up. A cart that once totaled $60 now regularly climbs past $90. And often it isn't the big ticket purchases driving that jump, it's the small, easy-to-overlook items nobody plans around. Part of that comes down to fuel costs. When fuel prices rise, that increase quietly works through the entire supply chain, the delivery truck, the packaging, the warehouse operations, before landing on a price tag that feels disconnected from anything you did. Then there's the supply chain itself, more fragile than most shoppers realize until something breaks. A single disruption, a factory slowdown, a storm blocking a shipping route, a sudden spike in demand can ripple outward for weeks. A hurricane touches down in one region and shelves empty hundreds of miles away because trucks got rerouted or a warehouse fell behind. Human behavior adds another layer. The moment people sense even mild scarcity, buying habits shift instantly. It isn't panic, it's just how people are wired. Shoppers grab a little extra just in case, and that alone can turn a minor hiccup into a real, localized shortage. None of this predicts disaster. It's about recognizing a pattern that keeps repeating and using that awareness to make smarter choices before everyone else is fighting over the same shelf. Have you noticed prices quietly climbing on things you never used to think twice about? That's exactly where this list starts. 13. Over-the-counter medications, pain relievers, allergy medication, cold and flu remedies, antacids. Fever reducers, these are quiet necessities almost nobody thinks about until the bottle turns out empty. Unlike food or bottled water, medicine rarely earns its own line on a shopping list. It's tossed into the cart as an afterthought, which is exactly why so many households run short at the worst possible moment. For older adults, this matters more than it might seem. Chronic pain, joint stiffness, seasonal allergies, arthritis flare-ups for a lot of people. These are part of daily life, and running out of the medication that manages them can derail an entire week, especially when a pharmacy run isn't quick or convenient. Demand for these products is more predictable than it seems. During harder than expected flu seasons, certain shelves have thinned dramatically, children's formulas and senior-specific dosages especially, since manufacturers produce these in smaller batches. Families who assumed their pharmacy would always be stocked sometimes drove to 2 or 3 stores just to find the right bottle. There's a money-saving angle too. Store brand versions bought calmly ahead of time are almost always cheaper than name brand versions grabbed in a rush during a bad flu week. Keeping a modest, rotating supply on hand and periodically checking expiration dates means never facing a difficult week without relief already in the medicine cabinet. There's another medication-related step that matters even more, covered further down this list. But first, a category many households overlook entirely. 12. Pet food. It's easy to forget the household pet when planning for emergencies. Most checklists focus on people, food, water, medicine, while the family dog or cat gets filed under. We'll figure that out later. But for a huge number of seniors, a pet is genuine companionship. Sometimes the one steady presence in an otherwise quiet home, which changes how much this item actually matters. Pet food follows nearly the same disruption pattern as human groceries, it just doesn't get the same attention. When supply chains slow down, it isn't prioritized the way baby formula or bottled water is, so it sits lower on the list and takes far longer to restock once it disappears. That delay is especially clear with specialty and prescription pet foods. During earlier supply chain slowdowns, these formulations were consistently among the hardest products to find, sometimes taking weeks longer to reappear than standard grocery staples. For a pet managing a health condition, an abrupt diet switch can trigger its own complications, from stomach upset to more serious issues. A rotating backup supply solves this easily. Buying a few weeks ahead of need rather than restocking the instant a bag runs low removes the risk of a last-minute substitution. there's a budget benefit too. Larger bags bought during regular sales cycles consistently cost less per pound than smaller bags grab reactively savings that add up across a year in multi-pet households. Which item on this list do you already keep stocked without thinking twice? For pet owners, this one often slips through the cracks until it's needed most. 11. Canned proteins. Canned protein rarely gets much attention on a typical grocery run. It sits quietly on the shelf, easy to skip past in favor of whatever looks fresh in the meat case. But the moment a freezer stops working or fresh meat prices climb beyond the budget, that overlooked can become one of the most valuable items in the pantry. These cans deliver more nutritional value than most households realize. Canned tuna, chicken, and beans aren't empty filler. They provide real protein and staying power, and beans add valuable fiber. Unlike fresh meat, they store safely for years without refrigeration. There's a consumer trend worth noting. During previous stretches when meat prices spiked, canned protein sales climbed right alongside them as households quietly adjusted their shopping habits. Nothing dramatic. People simply redirected part of their protein spending towards something shelf-stable and reliable. That's the real payoff of building a rotating shelf of canned protein. When fresh options become scarce or expensive, meals stay balanced instead of falling apart. A can of chicken turns into a quick soup. A can of beans becomes the foundation of a hearty stew. The financial case holds up on its own too. Bought during sales and rotated properly, oldest cans used first canned protein is nearly always cheaper per serving than fresh meat. The next item follows similar logic, but touches something even more fundamental to a household's everyday routine. 10. Cooking oil. Cooking oil is one of those staples nobody thinks about until the bottle runs dry mid-recipe. It sits in the pantry, unremarkable, easy to assume it'll always cost roughly what it did last time, but oil has a track record that catches households off guard once they look closer, a history of price swings that seem to come from nowhere. Few shoppers consider how far the supply chain behind a bottle of cooking oil stretches. Oil is tied to global agricultural markets' crop yields, planting seasons, growing conditions in countries most people never think about. A disruption thousands of miles away can still show up as a higher price tag months later. That's exactly what happened during past agricultural disruptions overseas. Cooking oil prices in American grocery stores climbed noticeably within months. And because the cause was so far removed from anything visible locally, plenty of households were caught off guard. There was no local news story to explain it. The price simply went up. A modest backup supply smooths out that volatility. It doesn't need to be excessive, just enough to absorb a price spike without throwing off weekly meal planning. Buying during a price dip rather than reactively after prices jump protects against exactly the kind of increase that's happened before and will likely happen again. From here, the list moves into items tied more directly to health and hygiene. 9. Toilet paper and paper products. This one barely needs an introduction. Most people remember exactly what happened the last time this aisle emptied out the bare shelves, the news coverage, that unsettling feeling of watching something so ordinary become impossible to find. What makes paper products unusual is that the shortage rarely starts with an actual production problem. Few items trigger as fast a consumer reaction as toilet paper, which is why it vanishes so quickly. The moment shoppers spot empty shelves or even hear a rumor of them buying accelerates, not because anyone needs 6 months' worth, but because nobody wants to be left without any. That's precisely what unfolded during a widely reported shortage in recent years. Shelves cleared out within days across much of the country, and by most accounts. The root cause wasn't a production shortfall, it was a wave of buying that fed on itself. Manufacturers were producing roughly the same volume as always. It was demand, not supply, that broke the system. A steady, modest backstock is the simplest defense against this pattern. It doesn't need to be extreme, just enough to comfortably ride out a few unpredictable weeks. There's a clear budget case too. Buying in bulk during regular sales cycles, rather than mid-panic, avoids the inflated prices that appear the moment stores start imposing per-customer limits. Have you noticed how fast this aisle can empty, even when nothing is actually wrong with the supply chain? That pattern is worth remembering, because the next few entries follow it closely. 8. Hand sanitizer and disinfecting supplies hygiene products follow nearly the same panic buying pattern as paper goods shelves that look normal one week and pick clean the next. But there's an added layer here that pushes this item slightly higher on the list, and it comes down to timing. For older adults managing existing health vulnerabilities, disinfecting supplies aren't just a nice to have during flu season. They're a genuine line of defense, and that matters because of a frustrating pattern. These products become hardest to find at precisely the moment they matter most. Nobody stocks up on hand sanitizer during a quiet, healthy month. Demand surges the instant illness starts spreading through a community. During earlier flu seasons, disinfecting wipes and hand sanitizer grew hard to find for weeks, not because manufacturers stopped producing them, but because demand spiked all at once across an entire region. By the time most people realized they needed extra, the shelf was already bare. Keeping a modest supply on hand well before that window opens means never compromising on hygiene during exactly the moments it carries the most weight. There's a financial upside too. Stocking up during the off-season reliably avoids the price surges that follow nearly every outbreak headline. There's a reason this item outranks paper goods on this list, and it has everything to do with what's coming next. 7. Prescription medication backup plans. This item needs a clear disclaimer. It isn't about hoarding controlled substances or working around a doctor's instructions. It's something more modest and responsible and honest conversation with a physician or pharmacist about building a small, medically appropriate buffer wherever reasonably possible. For seniors managing ongoing health conditions, this is closer to a necessity than a preference. For someone managing blood pressure, heart rhythm, thyroid function, or any chronic condition, even a short gap in access can carry serious consequences. This risk isn't hypothetical. Past supply chain disruptions have caused genuine temporary shortages of certain generic medications from manufacturing slowdowns, sourcing problems, and distribution delays. Patients and pharmacists scrambled for alternatives, sometimes calling multiple pharmacies just to fill a routine prescription. The benefit here is simple and collaborative rather than something a household handles alone. Talking with a healthcare provider about a slightly larger supply, where medically appropriate and insurance permitted, can prevent that scramble entirely. There's a financial angle too. Mail-order pharmacy programs often provide 90-day supplies at a meaningfully lower cost per dose than repeated monthly refills. Would your household genuinely stay calm if a medication refill were delayed by a full week or two? For many people, that question quietly reframes everything else on this list. 6. Shelf-stable milk and dairy alternatives. Shelf-stable milk, powdered milk, and dairy alternatives rarely get much attention during a normal shopping trip. They sit quietly on a lower shelf, overshadowed by the refrigerated case a few aisles away. Most households never think about them until fresh dairy becomes harder to find or afford, and that overlooked shelf becomes the only dependable option left. Fresh dairy is one of the more perishable staples in a typical kitchen, which also makes it one of the first categories affected the moment transportation slows down. Unlike canned goods, fresh milk can't sit in a warehouse waiting for a delayed truck. It has a short shelf life, and once that window closes, it closes across the supply chain at once. That fragility showed up during several regional disruptions. Fresh dairy was among the first to see reduced availability, precisely because it can't be stockpiled the way shelf-stable goods can. Meanwhile, the powdered alternatives on that lower shelf stayed unaffected by the same slowdown, emptying the refrigerated section nearby. A modest backup of shelf-stable dairy solves this quietly. Breakfast routines, baking, and cooking don't have to pause just because fresh milk didn't make the delivery truck that week. There's a financial upside too. Shelf-stable versions typically cost less per unit than fresh dairy, and since they don't spoil on the same tight timeline, they create far less waste. We're closing in on the items that matter most now, and this next one surprises a lot of people. 4. Manual tools and non-electric backups. A manual can opener. A crank-powered, battery-free radio, a simple way to heat food without a stove or microwave. These items rarely cross anyone's mind until every electric alternative fails at the same moment, and that moment tends to arrive with almost no warning. Modern daily life is built around electric convenience can openers, induction cooktops, digital radios, kettles woven so seamlessly into routine that their absence barely registers as a possibility. That's why a power outage can affect far more than the lights, quietly stripping away the tools behind dozens of everyday tasks at once. That gap becomes obvious fast during an extended outage. Past events show a consistent pattern: households with manual backups for basic tasks, opening a can of soup, preparing a simple meal. Staying informed through a battery-free radio got through noticeably more comfortably than neighbors without them. It was about having tools that didn't care whether the grid was working. There's another advantage often overlooked. These tools don't degrade in storage the way batteries or food eventually do. A manual can opener bought today will work the same way 20 years from now. The financial case is about as simple as anything on this list. Most manual tools are inexpensive, one-time purchases that quietly last for decades without ever needing to be replaced. The next item is one that history shows gets overlooked again and again, right up until it's desperately needed. 3. A reliable cash reserve. This isn't about stacks of bills hidden under a mattress. And it isn't rooted in distrust of banks. It's simpler and more practical, keeping a modest amount of accessible cash in small, usable bills set aside to cover essentials if electronic payment systems suddenly go down. Card payments and ATMs rely on the same electrical and network infrastructure as everything else. A power outage or regional network disruption can shut down card readers across an entire area, even when the store itself stays fully open and stocked. That exact scenario has played out during various regional outages. Stores stayed open, sometimes running on generators, but the payment network itself was down. Customers carrying nothing but a debit card stood in a fully stocked store, unable to buy anything, while the shoppers carrying cash walked out with exactly what they needed. A modest cash reserve solves this instantly. It doesn't need to be a large sum, just enough for a few days of essentials, kept somewhere secure and easy to reach. Worth noting, this isn't a money-saving strategy the way bulk buying is elsewhere on this list. It's about making sure money a household already has stays genuinely usable, no matter what the power grid or payment networks are doing that day. We're almost at the top of the list now, and the next item ties together nearly every lesson covered so far. 2. A 2-week rotating food supply. This isn't about a bunker's worth of supplies or filling a basement with enough food for a full year. It's something more manageable, a genuine 2-week rotation of shelf-stable meals a household actually eats, built from ordinary groceries used and replaced continuously. 2 weeks isn't an arbitrary number, it's a window that comfortably absorbs most realistic disruptions, from weather events to supply slowdowns to temporary income gaps, without requiring the kind of extreme stockpiling that leads to waste and food quietly expiring unnoticed. Households that maintained a rotating 2-week supply during past disruptions consistently reported far less stress and far fewer emergency store runs than those shopping reactively, always one trip behind. It wasn't that they had dramatically more food, it was that they never needed something immediately without having it on hand. That's the core reason this habit matters more than almost anything else on this list. It buys time to ride out a shortage instead of panicking through it, to find substitutes if something's unavailable, to avoid the inflated prices that follow every rush on a shelf. This single habit smooths out nearly every other item already covered. The financial case is just as strong. Rotating stock, purchased steadily during regular sales cycles rather than assembled during a scare, consistently costs less than reactive shopping during an actual shortage. And that brings us to the one item experienced, well-prepared households consistently say matters more than any other. 1. A written household emergency plan. This final item isn't a product. It can't be purchased or stacked on a shelf next to the batteries and canned goods. But across every genuine preparedness conversation, it turns out to be the single most overlooked item on this entire list, and the one that determines whether everything else here actually works when it matters. Here's the uncomfortable truth many households don't grasp until it's too late: supplies don't help much if nobody knows where they are. A closet full of batteries, water, canned protein, and first aid supplies means little if, in an actual emergency, family members are wandering the house confused, unsure who's responsible for what or what step comes first. In surveys conducted after past disruptions, a clear pattern emerged. Families with even a simple written plan, a single page noting where supplies are kept, who calls whom, and the first 3 steps consistently reported feeling calmer and more in control than families without one. Notably, this held true regardless of how well stocked either household was. A moderately prepared family with a clear plan often felt more confident than a heavily stocked family with no plan at all. That's the entire value of this final item. A written plan turns a dozen separate supplies into a coordinated system rather than a pile of useful things nobody knows how to use under stress. It's the difference between a household that reacts and one that simply executes. It costs nothing but time to put together, yet it multiplies the value of every item already covered, turning a stockpile into an actual plan. None of this is about fear. It's about recognizing a pattern that's shown up again and again in past shortages, outages, and disruptions, and using it to make quiet, sensible decisions before everyone else is scrambling for the same shelf. Every item on this list shares the same purpose: buying time, reducing stress, and protecting the people who depend on you. From over-the-counter medication to a written plan, the theme stays the same. Preparedness isn't about predicting the worst-case scenario. It's about making sure that if the worst does arrive, it's an inconvenience instead of a full-blown crisis. You're not panicking. You're preparing. And that distinction is what separates a stressful week from a manageable one. If you found this guide helpful, let us know which item you already have covered and which one caught you off guard. And if you'd like more practical preparedness tips like this one, consider subscribing for future updates.